Hello, welcome to the latest episode of Data in the Hallway. Here with my co-host Daniel Van Eden, sitting in front of a nice background. Hi, Daniel. How are you?
I'm good.
Good,
Thanks.
nice picture, like a wintry picture as we're trying to say goodbye to the winter. Like to see how that goes. We're excited to be joined today by Mattias Jonsson, who is a senior database engineer who's based in Amsterdam, not too far away from Daniel. It's good to see you again, Matthias.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh,
Glad to be
cool.
here.
Yeah, good. It's good to be here. Yeah, the topic today, as people could glean from the title, we wanted to talk about the work the TiDB team has done on our DDL performance, and there's a nice blog post that was published recently about our journey, roughly over the past year or so between our releases 7.5 to 8.5. We'll include the link to that blog post that people could read in more detail. And a lot of the improvements we made, roughly over like a 12-month period. So we wanted to talk about that. And it's good to have somebody from the engineering team that can provide a lot of the details. So we'll start with the basics, I guess. So like Matthias, tell us about, so what is like a DDL and why is this important?
So you can actually see that compared to the more relational databases, SQL and so on, with the NoSQL, that's a big thing that forces or moved people to the NoSQL. That relational databases has a schema, so you're formatting all the data into rows containing different columns, and you have to specify these columns in advance and push them into insert and handle those databases base formats. And the problem then is, oh, now I'm missing a column, or I need to change a column. That type of structure changes. That's called DDL, or data definition language. So that's an alter table, or it can also be add index and so on. And that's usually a bit of burden, especially on operating staff. Then it's always a bit of a clash between operations as well as developers, because developers want to move fast and want to change things, etc. And often the databases, it's a lot of overhead and it takes power, and it's a bit of a hassle to actually make those changes in most other databases. It even can lead to blocking new transactions or stalling the database and so on and so forth. So that's why it's quite important actually to have good online DDLs or alter tables.
Right, right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think like I can definitely see clashes happening. I mean, you're running a business, like an online business, so you're trying to process transactions, but at the same time, you want to alter, I mean, what I call like a data structures in the back end. And then, if that takes too long, then it could potentially impact um, your ability to serve customers or serve transactions. So,
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned like online DDL, like, so what is like a DDL versus like an online DDL? Like,
So traditional DDL has more or less blocked the operations before. If we're looking at MySQL, for example, it would more or less lock the whole table, and then it would do a copy of the full table to the new structure, and then unlock it with a new structure. That was the original way of doing DDLs in the MySQL, and then they added more faster implementations and even like instant added columns, etc. The thing is that it still takes a metadata lock. So there's a hard lock where all transactions need to finish, and new transactions can't be started or using that table. So when the old transactions are finished, then the DDL can actually go in and do the change for the table, and then it lets the new transactions in again. So that can also make a bit of blocking and hiccups in the database, which of course affects production and so on. So in Oracle World MySQL, where they still call that online, but there's still a metadata lock happening there.
And
Yeah.
If you have a DDL, what's the regular runtime of a DDL? Is it like minutes, seconds, hours?
It can be anything from milliseconds if you're doing something that's only need to change metadata, for example, adding a column, then you don't need to actually touch any of the existing rows and so on, depending on your implementation, of course. But normally adding a column should not need to rewrite any data or so. So that can be instant, more or less. And then you have like add index. Then, of course, you need to read all the rows and sort the index columns and write that. So generating that index takes quite some time, depending how you're implementing it. So that can be anything from seconds to days or even months. I think I've seen in production DDL going on for 3 months while running on productions.
Oh, wow. And like if we're talking about DDL, we're talking about like create table, alter table, drop table, those kind of
Yeah,
statements. But
yeah, that's the most normal ones.
mostly alter
And
table and maybe like create index, right?
yeah, and there's different syntax, and that alter table can more or less do all of them, even though you have the syntax for create index, etc. So definitely,
Cool.
and another example would be if you do a modify column, so you're changing a column where you have some kind of conversion that's not always deemed to be approved or work. For example, you're moving an 64-bit integer to a 32-bit integer, then if there would be an overflow, that should fail. So that means that you need to read everything, for example. So there's a bit of different physical alter tables or physical DDLs that are impacted as well.
Cool. Yeah, I mean that's definitely helpful. I can't imagine a 3 month DDL operation, but uh, sometimes that's what you have to deal with. So, and I mentioned like the blog post where people can read like how like things have improved, like for operations like table creation. I think that's one of the examples they provided from 7.5 to 8.5. I think 7.5 was released. I'm checking the dates on our release notes, was December 2023, so quite a while ago. So what was the state of our, I mean, I think we can be pretty frank here and open about it, like as a blog post was, what were some of the challenges with like a TiDB's like online DDL operations
Yeah,
back
so
then?
I
Yeah.
would even go further
Yeah.
back
Yeah.
than 7.5. I think we did quite a few improvements already in 7.1. So before we more or less had all data copying and so on, data modification would read the old data and insert it in like small batch transactions in the background. And then we implemented the ingest way. So that's similar to what we do with Lightning and now the import command, where we can actually read data and we're generating the SSD files for RocksDB directly. So we're bypassing the transaction layer and a lot of other things to make it faster. So we can just provide the fully written SSD files directly to TiKV where it should be. And that means that we're both offloading the system as well as removing a lot of overhead for writing a new index or a fully new imported table, for example. So the add index, for example, improved a lot already then from doing this small batch transactions to generate the SSD files. I think the total amount of that plus other works was a bit more than 10x in performance already then. And then the changes you're talking about now, it's more of a concurrent DDLs where you have a lot of changes you need to do in short while. Not too much of the physical rewrites. It's more of adding more data, more metadata, such as creating more tables and so on when you're bootstrapping a database or doing testing, etc. That's more of optimizing how we take locks internally when we do when we do the DDLs and adding things. Instead of waiting for one table at a time, we can actually add metadata for multiple tables at a time. So one of the core concepts we're using is schema version. And we need to go in schema versions one by one. And a big deal of our architecture is about we can actually use two different schemas. So the current schema and the previous schema, that's valid to use for any of the connections, which means that we can step one schema at a time. That's how we do the whole online schema changes without blocking any transactions. So transaction can use the current schema, and then a new schema can come. Then it will wait a bit and allow transactions to use both of them instead of having a metadata lock like MySQL, for example. And that's what we also improved with this create table optimization, for example, that we can add more tables to these schema change schema versions.
And all the changes in TiDB are online, right?
Yes, we don't have any blocking or offline DDLs, which also means that there's some limitations on what you can do on TiDB. You can't rewrite the primary key if it's a clustered primary key, for example.
So that's also why you don't need external tools like Ghost or PT online schema change, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you can more or less say that we do that internally in the cluster, because we do the double copying, double writing internally as well during the DDLs.
Yeah, and I think this all sounds somewhat complicated, but for a user, from a user standpoint, you just run the statement and it just works.
Yeah, it can be a bit confusing sometimes when you're used to locks and how it's set up in other databases, but it's more, it's easier and instead of thinking of the problems that MySQL had, then you don't see them in TiDB instead, so it can be a bit confusing, yes.
Yeah, so hopefully, I mean, I don't know if this is the right term for it. Like the benefits should be just transparent to the users. Hopefully, like you don't have to think about the internals. That's why we did a lot of the work. I mean, what I was very impressed with when I read the blog post. I mean, this is a long running project. I mean, like you said, Mattias, this goes even before like 7.5. So, and I like the fact that our team took a very iterative approach to sort of nipping at the problem. Like it wasn't just like a one big big bang effort. It was like over like 15 plus months period where a lot of people worked on this for a long time. So.
Yeah. And that's a bit how we actually work in R&D. So, for example, the whole idea about the online DDLs comes from a paper from Google, Online Schema Changes in F1 Spanner, I think it is the title of it. So we're not afraid of using existing ideas or new ideas that was not invented at PingCAP. We're all for doing that if it seems to be a good fit. As well as we do start to make sure that something works without issues. So we better do something correctly than fast in the first implementation. And then we can iterate of that and optimizing and so on. And that also means that the stability actually increases as well, because we're also adding more and more tests from the correctness view. And then in the speed up and so on, we still need to pass all those tests.
Right. Yeah, and it was also like impressive to see, like, I mean, I'm going off of memory here, so sorry if my recollection isn't 100% correct. Like, I think they were looking at like a QPS improvements over a couple of DMR releases, I think from like 8.1 to 8.2 to 8.3. And like each iteration, there were like a 4 to 5x improvements, which is pretty impressive. So I'm sure there was, I mean, when I read that, section of the blog post, I understood why. Like when I talked to RDG engineers, they were very excited about like improvements they were seeing. So I truly like appreciated that. So
Yeah, and it also goes hand in hand. We have another project that internally we call the million table project. So we wanted to support at least 1 million tables easily in the TiDB cluster, and that's something that has gone side by side with this as well. So while changing something to make like caching table information and so on more efficient, we also made sure that it was faster as well.
cool. So, I mean, now, I mean, obviously this work is ongoing. I mean, the work is, never finished. And then, I want to also quickly mention, I'll add a link to it on the episode description as well. Like people can check out we have a public roadmap in our docs pages. I think we have something planned for sometime this year that can check out. Like, but that's something that the work's gonna continue. But as part of your job, I mean, Mattias, you also talked to a lot of our users and customers. Like, I don't know if you heard any feedback on what they notice from our ongoing DDL work. But
yeah, so a bit of that is basically coming back to what Daniel asked about before, that users are thinking that it must be hard from a user perspective to set up the database or a cluster, or how can you actually use this so it works? And most of the answers actually within TiDB from a user perspective is it just works. So there's very little you need to do for doing this. Online DDLs, there's nothing you need to write in any locking or implementation or anything like that. You just issue an alter table and it will automatically be online, and it will be very efficient as well.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, like I'm stating the obvious here, but in addition to like the performance improvements or performance numbers that we talked about, it's a quality of life thing. Like you just don't have to worry about it. It's magically just taken care of for you.
Yeah,
So.
and of course, if there's things that you want to try to tune or anything like that, you can do quite a lot as well. But by default, it's still very performant and doesn't take all the resources of the cluster. It's a bit of throttling and so on.
Cool. Right. Daniel, I wasn't sure if you were about to jump in here or not, but no? Okay, cool.
No.
So, yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I highly recommend. I mean, I'm not saying this in a negative way. It's a long blog post, which I like because there's a lot of details about the long journey that our engineers took to improve like a DDL performance. So I strongly encourage people to read that. And obviously I'm biased, but I thoroughly enjoyed it and appreciated the work that went into improving our online DDL. So, Mattias, anything else you want to add? Anything I should have asked and forgot to? But.
No, not really. So if you just compare the latest work we've done, that's more or less focusing on QPS or a number of DDLs you can do. So that's when you need to add a lot of the tables to do small metadata changes as well. So that's something we have made much faster recently. And previously, before that, we made sure that long-running transactions was also very fast. Long-running DDLs was as fast as we could, more or less, by doing this ingest way. So skipping the whole transaction layers and so on, and generating the files before. So it's a bit different use cases. What you need if you're doing tests and so on, then you want to have creation as fast as possible. But if you're already in production and have a really huge table that you want a new index on, etc., that's when the previous work really comes handy.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you. Yeah, and then as we continue to make progress on online DDL, like we could probably call on you again, Mattias, to provide an update in the future, if you don't mind.
No, I'm still working with a bit of that for, I mean, I work mostly with the table partitioning in TiDB, and that's something that I've implemented the online DDLs for when you do a reorganized partition, for example. So you have one set of partitions that you want to format in a different set of partitions, or for that part, merge partitions or split partitions and so on. And that's very easy in MySQL when you just block everything and copy the data and then start it again, more or less. But if you need to make sure that we can use the data for reading and writing during this copy phase and making sure everything is correct during the way, there's no glitches in between and no missed rows or anything like that, but a consistent view regardless where in the DDL process you are. It's quite interesting to work on, actually, and very different from my previous experience.
Cool. Awesome. All right. So I think we reached the end of the episode. I mean, appreciate, Mattias, you coming on and talking about a lot of the great work that our team, the TiDB team, has done on online DDL. So we have a tradition in our podcast. We call this like a closing trivia. We like to get, I mean, from my selfish perspective, I love to get travel tips because I like to travel. And you've been living in a wonderful city of Amsterdam for the past several years. We had a guest I had to check about a year ago from we had an Amazon hero, Jan Kooi, who happens to live in Amsterdam. So wanted to ask you, like, what are some of the interesting tidbits about Amsterdam that a lot of people may not know about that you want to share?
Yeah, so I moved into Amsterdam in the beginning of COVID times. So that made us having a lot of time to actually walking in the city due to restrictions and so on. So walking was one way to spend time, more or less. So there's a lot of nice streets and so on in Amsterdam. I wouldn't really now recommend walking the Wallen, or what's normally called the red light district, because it's very, very busy now. But during COVID time, then you could actually see all the beautiful buildings and so on that's there as well. So I would really recommend just walking around in the different areas of Amsterdam. You have like the Jordan, which is quite nice, with a lot of nice small restaurants and so on, and shops. And yeah, there's so many different areas. You have like the big Albert Kuip market in the Pipe, and a lot of nice bars and so on there as well. And biking is also really easy to take you from one part of the city to another. Actually, driving in city center Amsterdam, it's extremely hard, actually. I once spent 2 hours just getting back to the same point because I did one wrong turn. That was a Saturday evening, and now it's even worse because you basically shouldn't drive car in the city center Amsterdam. You take a bike or a tram or metro or something like that.
Cool. Yeah, nice tip. Yeah, I think people don't appreciate the pleasure, the joy you can get from walking, especially in a lot of European cities. But I mean, I think Amsterdam is another one of those as well, with lots of not just sights, but just beautiful buildings and interesting neighborhoods. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. So yeah, I mean, good. Thanks again for coming on to our podcast, and we'll look forward to having you back on again. So,
Thank you.
All right, thanks very much.